In the summer of 1965, Owen Harris, a 3-year-old boy playing behind the mobile home next to the Ocala forest, stepped out of his parents' sight for less than a minute and vanished. No cry for help, no drag marks, not a single item left behind. More than half a century later, his case file is still labeled missing under unexplained circumstances, becoming an obsession for the entire Marion County. The rotting cabins, the hidden water trails under the forest canopy, and the unidentified green pickup truck only make the story more tangled, like the intertwined roots. Then, when the record's digitization program in 2024 began, a sealed envelope from 1965 surfaced, and inside it was a clue that blew open the door to a truth no one could have imagined. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the afternoon of July 14, 1965, in the residential area bordering Ocala National Forest in northern Florida, the weather was typical summer in the dense woods. Hot, humid, the air seeming to stick to the skin, with cicadas, insects, and rustling leaves creating the familiar background noise. Late-day sunlight stretched into deep golden streaks across the dirt yard behind the mobile home where the Harris family lived. Owen Harris, the 3-year-old boy, was playing around that area, wandering back and forth between an old wooden chair and the low fence running along the edge of the yard. He appeared in his parents' view whenever they glanced outside by chance, the mother occasionally stepping through the back door to check, the father bent over fixing tools near the small boat parked beside the house. No one noticed anything unusual. A neighbor walking along the dirt road in front of the house, while carrying mail and grocery bags home, saw Owen standing near the forest edge, a bit farther from the yard than usual but not far enough to cause concern. An older child who lived nearby said that a few minutes earlier he had seen Owen holding a long stick, lightly swinging it at the fence as if imitating the exploration games the kids in the area often played. Those small details didn't draw anyone's attention, because children wandering around the backyard here was completely normal. The afternoon wind picked up suddenly, causing the back door to slam hard against the wooden frame, the sound loud enough to make the mother turn and look reflexively. In that moment, she called Owen's name out of habit, whenever she wanted to check if the boy was still nearby. There was no answer. She quickly stepped down the porch stairs, looked around the yard, then called louder. Still no sign of Owen in the area where he had been playing just minutes before. The father stopped his work, stood up to look, then joined his wife in checking around the mobile home, then opened the door and ran inside to the bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, laundry room all empty of Owen. They moved to the adjacent area, ran along the fence, looked into the space behind the neighbor's car, then to the front yard. With every step, the strange silence became more noticeable. No sound of a child's running feet. No laughter. No familiar clumsy noises Owen made when moving over the gravel patches. After a few minutes, the initial calm vanished. They checked under the porch, behind the large tree, around the storage bins, then circled back to the area near the forest edge, where there was no longer any sign that Owen had been standing there. Another quick search was done with even more desperation, but the result was the same. Owen was nowhere in any of the places he usually went. The surrounding air suddenly felt unnaturally thick, silent to the point that the mother realized she hadn't heard the insects for a while. The feeling that something was wrong spread quickly, causing the father to run straight out to the dirt road in front of the house, hoping Owen had just gone in another direction, but the area was still empty. After more than 10 minutes of frantic searching and finding no trace that Owen was still nearby, both realized this was no longer an ordinary case of a child wandering off. In rapidly growing fear, they went back inside the house, picked up the landline phone, and called the police, reporting that their son had disappeared. When the missing person call was routed to the Marion County Sheriff's Office dispatch, the unit on duty classified it as a high-priority emergency involving a small child. A deputy patrolling less than 5 minutes away by car was dispatched straight to the address. When the patrol car turned onto the narrow dirt road and stopped in front of the mobile home, the atmosphere in the area had already shifted to one of clear alertness. Owen's parents, still in the shock of those first minutes, immediately pointed toward the backyard, the place they had just searched repeatedly without finding anything. The deputy approached the area, observed how the parents described events in a state of tension, and quickly determined this was not a typical case of a child wandering off. Owen's age, the time he vanished, the terrain right next to the forest, combined with the complete lack of any response from the child, led the deputy to assess the danger level as higher than usual. The first step in standard procedure was to define the scene perimeter. The deputy walked around the backyard, noting the location where the parents said Owen was last seen, while observing the yard layout, the fence, the back door, the paths leading to the forest, and the dirt road. There were no signs the child had gone back into the house, and no items were clearly left behind in the yard area, but that only strengthened the likelihood that Owen had left the yard in a direction out of sight. The deputy assessed the terrain. Behind the house opened a small patch of land, leading to the forest boundary, where the vegetation thickened just a few meters from the yard. To the right was a wooden fence extending toward the neighbor's house. To the left, a strip of open ground leading to a little-used trail. These three directions became the three priority directions for determining the route a child might have accidentally or been led away through. After preliminarily mapping the surroundings, the deputy began the step that every missing person investigation treats as critical: reconstructing the timeline of the 30 minutes before the disappearance. The deputy separated the mother and father to take individual statements, avoiding cross-influence. The goal was to pinpoint the exact last moment Owen was seen, the direction he was facing, the most recent behavior both observed, and the specific period when they no longer had eyes on him. The points that matched between the two statements helped the deputy mark the window of lost supervision, from the moment the mother heard the door slam and turned to call Owen, until both began frantically searching. That window, by initial estimate, ranged from 3 to 5 minutes. With the average movement speed of a 3-year-old and the terrain of the area, that time was not enough for Owen to travel very far, unless he was carried or led away in some other manner. Next, the deputy sought witnesses in the surrounding area. A neighbor who passed by early in the afternoon confirmed seeing Owen standing near the forest edge about 10 minutes before the disappearance. This matched the parents' account that Owen had at one point been close to the fence. A child who lived nearby also provided information about seeing Owen holding a stick and walking along the fence. Though information from children is often less precise, it was still added to the timeline because the timing of this witness's observation could narrow the period when Owen was still in a safe position. The deputy recorded the line of sight of each witness, the estimated time they described, and their specific location in the neighborhood when they saw Owen. The overlap in observation area, the zone near the fence and forest edge, led the deputy to mark this as the direction Owen most likely headed just before vanishing. After completing the rapid statement collection, the deputy opened the duty notebook to sketch a scene diagram: yard position, forest direction, trails, where witnesses stood, where parents last saw Owen, and the small movement distances between points. This diagram helped identify possible access points: the trail into the forest at the left corner of the yard, the dirt road in front a few steps away, and the unfenced gap between the property line and the trees. From there, the deputy assessed that the nearest forest entry, exit points, were all within a radius of under 30 meters from where the child was last seen. To ensure no initial traces were missed, the deputy asked everyone present to stay within their current range, not go deep into the forest, and not touch any suspicious spots. An internal call was made to report the situation. A professional search team was needed, K9 units for scent tracking were needed, and support was needed to expand the check to secondary trails around Ocala. Finally, the deputy concluded that this situation carried all the characteristics of a high-risk missing person case. A small child disappearing in a short time, dense forest terrain, multiple natural paths, and no signs the child returned to familiar areas. The initial scene report concluded that a large-scale search must begin immediately, because the possibility that Owen had simply wandered off decreased with each preliminary analysis. This was the point at which the official investigation was launched. Right after the initial scene report, the request for support was forwarded to the Marion County Search and Rescue Coordination Center. The K-9 team was dispatched to the scene along with rescue personnel experienced in operating within Ocala National Forest, where the terrain is dense, trails intertwine, and vegetation changes rapidly just a few steps in. By the time the support vehicles arrived, not too much time had passed since Owen's disappearance, meaning the chance for the tracking dogs to pick up the boy's scent was still relatively high. The search team began by collecting scent samples from Owen's clothing and blanket inside the house. The tracking dogs were brought to the backyard, the place the parents said they last saw Owen. As soon as it reached the area, the first dog reacted strongly. It moved in an arc around the yard, then headed straight toward the fence on the left side of the yard, the direction both the neighbor and the nearby child had described earlier. This was the first match between witness statements and the K-9 response. The tracking dog continued moving to the boundary between the yard and the forest. There, the terrain features became more challenging. Tree roots grew thick. The ground sank in patches, making trace identification difficult. Nevertheless, the K-9 maintained a steady direction for about 50 to 60 meters into the forest, then began to slow down. When it reached a small clearing in the woods, the dog suddenly lost the trail. It circled multiple times, sniffing nearby directions but could not regain the scent. For confirmation, the K-9 team deployed a second dog. The process was repeated, and the results were nearly identical. The scent led to the forest edge and then vanished. At the point where the trail was lost, one notable detail was recorded. Wind was blowing from inside the forest outward toward the yard, which could have diluted the scent or pulled it in the opposite direction, causing the dogs to lose accurate tracking ability. However, the sudden loss of scent over such a small area was still flagged as unusual and noted in the record for later analysis. In parallel with the K-9 units, the search team conducted a grid sweep of the area. The search grids were defined based on the small child behavior model recommended by Florida search units. 3-year-olds typically move in short straight lines toward attractive objects or around large obstacles and lack the ability to navigate difficult terrain. Based on this, the team identified 3 priority zones: the forest edge behind the house, the narrow trail to the left of the yard, and the open strip leading to the dirt road in front. The search group split into teams of 4 to 6 people, maintaining radio contact and moving in horizontal lines to ensure no gaps were missed. During the forest sweep, they noted many interfering signs: small animal tracks, footprints from people who had passed through in previous days, broken branches mixed into the dry leaf cover. However, no traces were identified as recent or clearly linked to Owen. This created difficulty for the search team because Ocala Forest has a high density of natural traces that often cover or distort initial signs. The next anomaly was recorded when one search team member discovered an area of horizontally disturbed soil not far from the K-9 trail loss point. The ground surface there appeared lightly compacted, as if moderate weight had been placed on it. Although the cause could not be determined, the team still marked the area for re-examination later because the soil disturbance did not match the natural movement pattern of a small child. Children usually leave clearer footprints rather than evenly compressed patches like that. While the groups swept the forest, another team was tasked with checking natural entry and exit points in the area. Gaps between the forest boundary and homes, collapsed fence sections, or trails leading deeper into the woods. Initial results showed no fences had been broken and no signs a small child had climbed over. The forest trails all had many old footprints from hikers and hunters, so it was impossible to identify any that were new. The failure to find significant physical evidence in the first few hours forced the search team to expand the perimeter while implementing a depth search strategy. Each successive search ring extended 300 to 500 meters farther than the previous one, forming concentric circles. However, even in the expanded radius, there was no sign of Owen, leading the team to conclude that it was highly likely the child had not ventured deep into the forest on his own. This hypothesis was taken seriously because Owen's near-total absence of traces did not fit the typical small child pattern of leaving trash, toys, or hesitant footprints at difficult-to-cross points. All forest sweep results were compiled by the commanding officer in the early evening. They determined that 1. The K9 units lost the trail at a very specific point, right at the forest edge. 2. There was no evidence strong enough to determine the next direction of movement. 3. The forest showed no indication Owen had gone deeper in. 4. Anomalies in the soil and wind direction may have altered the scent. With these findings, the command team reached a provisional conclusion. The possibility that Owen left the forest area by vehicle or through the intervention of another person could not be ruled out. However, there was no direct evidence to confirm this, so the search perimeter still had to continue expanding through the night, prioritizing areas near the home and roads that could lead out of the neighborhood. The difficulty of the initial search phase did not stem from lack of manpower, but from the complex nature of the Ocala terrain and the near-complete absence of traces. In a missing small child case, the first few hours are always critical, but here even the smallest signs failed to appear. The command team noted that this situation carried a clear unusual element, and internally concluded that if no new physical evidence emerged within the next 24 hours, the investigation direction would gradually shift from searching for a lost child to searching based on suspicion of third-party involvement. The morning of the next day, as the search expanded with a new grid layer, the first piece of physical evidence appeared in an area outside the natural movement direction of a small child. Search Team Number 3, deployed along the southern forest boundary, discovered a child's sock lying among the fallen leaves, with only a portion of the edge exposed due to wind and small animal movement overnight. The sock's location was more than 180 meters from the K9 trail loss point, but more importantly, it was offset to the right in a curving path, not in the direction all witness statements and small child behavior assessments had indicated. As soon as the sock was noted, the surrounding area was marked with stakes and boundary tape to avoid disturbing the scene. The evidence collection team approached with standard procedure, taking wide-angle photos, close-ups, marking the sock's relative position to a large tree, the forest direction, and the nearest trail. The sock was picked up with specialized tongs and placed in a paper bag to prevent contamination. Soil samples from 3 points around the sock were also taken for comparison of subsidence levels and surface structure. When the evidence was transferred to the temporary processing area in the mobile command unit, the investigation team evaluated the sock's discovery location based on the small child behavior simulation map. According to lost child search standards, 3-year-olds typically move in short, straight lines, avoid large obstacles, and do not create detours unless directly attracted. The path from the home yard to where the sock was found did not follow any small child behavior pattern. The route had thick tree roots, a low-lying patch of ground, and a cluster of sharp saw palmetto bushes, points a child would normally not cross. Terrain analysis indicated that for the sock to appear there were 3 possibilities. Owen dropped it himself in a situation where it slipped off while being carried. The person moving Owen accidentally dropped it, or the sock belonged to another child who had passed through the area. However, the third possibility was rated low, because the area was in dense vegetation with little foot traffic and no trail leading in. Continuing the evaluation, the investigation team compared the sock's position with the timeline provided by the family and witnesses. The fact that the sock was in a completely different direction suggested third-party intervention. The disappearance window lasted only about 3 to 5 minutes, not enough time for a child to travel from the yard to the discovery spot, crossing roots, thick brush, and terrain unsuitable for the boy's motor abilities. Thus, the sock became the first piece of evidence indicating that Owen's movement was highly likely not self-initiated. The investigation team then conducted a detailed analysis of the sock's freshness. Light soil adhesion on the fabric edge showed it had not been there long, but it was not completely freshly dropped either. There were no signs of water absorption or rot, indicating it had been there less than a day. This matched the disappearance timing from the previous day. The contact site of the sock faced southeast, opposite the direction the search team had assumed a small child might take. This increased the plausibility of the hypothesis that the evidence was dropped during movement by someone else carrying it. After obtaining the first piece of evidence, the search command had to readjust the search perimeter using a triangular model. The K9 trail loss point, the sock location, and the likely direction of object movement. This triangle created a new area to sweep, completely offset from the initial search direction. This also meant traces might have been missed in a region not prioritized on the first search day. While the evidence investigation team analyzed the sock, the forest sweep teams returned to the southeast area to look for additional related signs. At several nearby spots, they found lightly subsided soil points, not clear enough to conclude as footprints, but also not typical animal marks. The shape and depth did not match small child footprints. This once again reinforced suspicion that an adult had moved through the area in the same time frame. The most important aspect at this stage was determining whether the sock actually belonged to Owen. The parents could only confirm they had put socks on Owen that morning but could not recall the exact color or pattern because many pairs in the house were similar. Nevertheless, the sock's structure and size matched the type typically worn by 3-year-olds in that era, and there were no reports of other missing children in the area at the same time. The scene report was updated immediately afterward. The sock became the first piece of evidence with investigative directional value. The command team reviewed all hypotheses about Owen's movement direction, ruling out the possibility the boy wandered deep into the forest in a straight line. Instead, they shifted to evaluating the scenario of the child being carried away. This fit better with the rapid disappearance speed and the offset evidence location. The appearance of the sock did not solve the mystery, but it created a critical turning point. It was the first data point allowing the search team to assess that Owen's disappearance was highly likely no longer a simple lost child case but may have moved closer to a missing person case involving intervention by another party. The forest sweep teams continued expanding the perimeter, awaiting additional evidence that could strengthen this hypothesis. Right after the sock was collected and its location analyzed, the search team shifted the sweep to the area between the K9 trail loss point and the location where the first piece of evidence was discovered. This was a wide crescent-shaped zone with complex terrain, multiple layers of fallen leaves, intertwined tree roots, and mixed soft mud, requiring extremely careful trace evaluation. Search Team Number 2 discovered a series of small footprints, initially considered child footprints, but needing further analysis to confirm. These prints appeared at relatively even intervals, but not in a straight line, instead deviating in several small directions, characteristic of the short and unsteady stride of a 3-year-old. When the ground analysis team examined more closely, they discovered interspersed among the small footprints were distinctly larger footprints. These larger prints did not follow the same rhythm as the child's. Instead of running parallel or ahead, they appeared interwoven but with longer stride lengths. This made the footprint sequence unusual, because if it were a child walking alone and an adult trying to search behind, the adult prints would typically appear later, not interwoven into the stride like that. The fact that both footprint sizes appeared in the same flat soil section indicated a high likelihood that at some point an adult and a small child were moving simultaneously or very close together. When mapping the footprint positions, the investigation team noticed that the larger footprint sequence only appeared over a short distance, then vanished completely. There were no drag marks, no circling movements, no continuing shoe prints ahead. They stopped abruptly, as if the person leaving them had lifted off the ground at that recorded spot or immediately shifted to harder terrain. Cases where adult footprints suddenly disappear usually have only a few causes. The person stepped onto a large root system and moved along it, jumped to a firm soil area with less imprint, or picked up the child, changing the direction of movement without leaving further traces. Meanwhile, the child footprints also ended at the same point where the adult prints stopped. There was no sign the child continued beyond that point, whether by toddling steps, crawling, sliding, or turning back. The fact that both types of footprints terminated at the exact same location was seen as a critical indicator. This could be the spot where there was a sudden change in Owen's mode of movement. The investigation team proceeded to measure the adult footprints. Each print size corresponded to an adult male shoe size, approximately size 10 to 11, with soil compression consistent with the average weight of a man 70 to 90 kilograms. The small child prints matched the foot size of a 3-year-old. Notably, the child prints had lighter subsidence and deformation at the toe tips, indicating unstable movement. This also aligned with a child showing signs of being pulled or moving while being urged. The distance between the larger footprints showed the person was moving purposefully, with a steady stride. In contrast, the child's stride was more irregular, some places too close together, others farther than a child could step. This suggested the possibility that at that moment, there was interaction between the two individuals, not independent movement. The stopping point of both footprint types was on a patch of firmer ground, where vegetation was thinner due to large exposed roots. This was a natural area capable of erasing movement signs if the adult's next step avoided soft soil. The investigation team noted that about 15 meters from this location was a natural opening, leading to a flatter strip of land suitable for an adult to pick up the child and continue without leaving traces. After analyzing all the data, the investigation team conducted a comprehensive evaluation. If Owen had been walking on his own, the footprint sequence would extend farther, be more evenly distributed, and not stop abruptly. If an adult had been following, the adult prints would continue parallel or ahead in the child's direction. However, both footprint types ending at the same spot and the sudden disappearance of the adult prints did not fit any pattern consistent with searching for a lost child in a natural setting. These findings moved beyond the assumption of a child wandering off on his own and closer to a different investigative model: third-party intervention. The hypothesis was formed that after the two sets of footprints moved together to one point, the adult stopped, lifted the child, and left the spot via a path that left no footprints, possibly by stepping onto roots, large rocks, or shifting direction to the firmer ground ahead. This forced the investigation team to seriously consider the possibility that Owen did not leave the yard area on his own, but was led away in the short time after losing parental line of sight. Though there was still no strong evidence to confirm it, the appearance of the two footprint types and the way they simultaneously stopped provided the basis for forming the first serious hypothesis. Owen was highly likely carried away from the scene. This was the first turning point in the investigation process, and the foundation for the search team to prepare to expand the perimeter, while shifting focus from the possibility of a child wandering off to the possibility that an adult had intervened in the boy's disappearance. When analyzing the footprint sequence that ended abruptly on the firmer ground, the investigation team realized they needed to sweep all directions for leaving the area without leaving further traces. Besides the possibility of moving along large roots or rocks, another direction drew attention: natural gaps in the vegetation leading to small water bodies around the forest. Ocala National Forest has a high density of ponds, streams, and sinkholes, creating many water access points only a few hundred meters from residential areas. This led the investigation team to expand analysis to the possibility that an adult carried Owen close to the water, where movement by boat could erase all subsequent traces. The information gathering team conducted a rapid witness sweep in the neighborhood for any observations related to sounds or movement on the water during the afternoon of July 14th. One witness living in the row of mobile homes a few units away from the Owen household reported hearing the sound of a small boat engine around the time of the disappearance. The sound was not loud and lasted only a short time, similar to the type of small outboard motor commonly used on shallow lakes. This was not direct evidence, but it held value because most small lakes in the area were not heavily used in the late afternoon, when most residents were indoors avoiding the heat. Another witness, living near an opening leading to Blue Sink, a natural lake within the forest, stated that around the same time period, he saw light reflecting on the water surface, like a low-moving flashlight beam. This information was recorded because it aligned with the timeline when the child and adult footprints ended in the forest. If the person carrying Owen used a boat, they likely moved quickly and under conditions concealing light, which is common in behavior aimed at avoiding detection. Based on the statements, the investigation team began building a boat movement model. The first thing to determine was how long it would take an adult carrying a child to reach the water, via which route, and whether the timing matched Owen's disappearance window. From the footprint stopping point to the nearest water access opening took only about 4 to 5 minutes on foot if heading southeast, matching the direction where the sock appeared. These openings were all easily accessible to someone familiar with the terrain, especially those who had previously operated in the forest or used boats in the area. Using forest maps and water body depths, the investigation team marked 3 possibilities. 1. The opening leading to Blue Sink. 2. The water access, near a small branch connecting to Silver Glen Springs. 3. A narrow water section leading to an unofficial boat landing once used by fishermen. All three were within a reasonable movement radius from the interrupted footprint point. Immediately after the model was built, the water search team was deployed for sweeping. Personnel used county boats, moving along water routes around Blue Sink and the small branches. No suspicious abandoned boats were found, but they noted a small patch of ground near the water, with compression traces as if something heavy had rested there, possibly a boat hull or wooden crate. Though not strong enough to conclude anything definitive, this detail suggested the spot may have been used on the day of the disappearance. Meanwhile, the analysis team continued narrowing down official boat ramps and water access points around the neighborhood. In Ocala at the time in 1965, many households owned small unregistered boats used for fishing or traveling between forest lakes. The boat owner list was retrieved from Marion County records and resident statements. Some boats were not found in their usual storage spots, but this was common and not yet grounds for suspicion. Nevertheless, the missing boats were flagged for later checking. The investigation team also examined the characteristics of the engine sound. The witness heard light sound, low vibration, short duration. This matched small outboard boats with 3 to 5 horsepower engines, typically used for personal purposes. Boats of this size are easy to transport, easy to hide, and can be operated by one person alone while carrying a child without drawing attention. From all the data, the investigation team concluded, if an adult took Owen to a boat, they either had a boat ready nearby or had prepared the access route in advance. This opened the suspicion range to local individuals familiar with the area and accustomed to traveling by boat. Though no specific suspect yet existed, the water route direction emerged as a plausible scenario in which the ground traces, especially the interrupted footprints, and the sock location, all aligned with the movement toward water access point model. At this point, despite lacking strong physical evidence like clothing, toys, or traces left on a boat, the obtained witness statements about water movement, combined with terrain analysis, led the investigation team to treat this as a supplementary priority direction. Teams continued sweeping around Blue Sink and water branches that could lead far from the neighborhood, because if Owen was taken onto a boat, the perpetrator's time and speed of movement would expand the perimeter beyond the Ocala edge in just minutes. The boat direction, though not yet backed by enough data to confirm, formed an independent investigative line running parallel to analysis of land points. This was the first time the hypothesis of Owen being taken away by water vehicle was seriously considered and incorporated into the overall diagram for subsequent investigation steps. While the water search teams continued sweeping Blue Sink and the nearby water branches, another team expanded the land perimeter in the southeast direction, where the footprints and the sock had been discovered. This area led deeper into the thinner part of Ocala Forest, where old wooden cabins once used by hunters and workers had been scattered from the 1940s to the early 1960s. Although most had been abandoned, the structures still remained in some locations. One such cabin was marked on the Forest Service map located about 1.7 miles as the crow flies from the Owen family yard. The investigation team decided to check this cabin, not because there was already related evidence, but because its position fell entirely within the triangular model built from the footprints, the boat direction, and the forest openings. To reach the cabin, the team had to pass through a section of dense forest before turning onto a narrow trail that was only faintly visible, indicating it had once been used for a long time but abandoned for many years. The cabin appeared after nearly an hour of movement. It was a small wooden structure with a low roof, rotting walls, and the front door slightly ajar despite rusted hinges. The investigation team did not approach immediately. Instead, they observed from a distance to determine if there were signs of recent activity. Around the cabin, there were no fresh footprints on the fallen leaves, but the scattered distribution of leaves at the doorstep showed the surface had been disturbed within the past few weeks or months. The level of disturbance was not clear enough to pinpoint exact timing, but it differed from a cabin truly abandoned for many years, where the leaf layer would be thicker and more intact. Upon approaching, the investigation team noted that the cabin door was not locked. This was not unusual for an abandoned cabin, but inside there were several details that made them pause for evaluation. On the dusty wooden floor, Where light filtered in from the window, there were small round marks resembling children's shoe prints. They were not sharp and not sufficient to determine exact size, but the shape and compression suggested a high likelihood of small shoes. These marks were unevenly spaced, similar to how a child moves in an unfamiliar space. Near one corner of the cabin, the team discovered a small, broken wooden stick lying on the floor. This could have been a piece of a homemade toy or a dry branch someone had brought in. At one end of the stick there was a longitudinal crack, as if it had been snapped by small hands or struck against a hard surface. The investigation team did not jump to conclusions, but still collected the sample because the smooth part suggested it might have been handled by a child's hand. The most notable detail was in the back wall corner. A patch of dust on the floor had been clearly swept away, creating a cleaner surface than the surroundings. A rectangular object approximately the size of a small blanket had once been placed there but had been moved. Nothing remained in that spot, but the dust outline showed the object had been in the cabin for a long time before being recently displaced. This raised the question for the investigation team whether the cabin had been used by someone else after abandonment. The team continued checking the area around the cabin. Outside, next to a partially rotted window frame, there was a pale-colored fabric scrap caught in the wood fibers. The fabric scrap was sampled and placed in an evidence bag for later testing. Beside the window, there was also a faint sliding mark on the vertical wood from top to bottom, as if someone had dragged something across it or brushed against it while passing. When checking the path behind the cabin, they found several lightly compressed soil spots, but not enough to identify as adult or child footprints. One of the details that made the cabin a greater point of suspicion was how its location fit the time factors. From the K9 trail loss point, if an adult carried the child and moved in a curving path avoiding the initial search routes, they could completely reach the cabin in about 30 to 40 minutes, enough to evade pursuit from the early search teams. The cabin was near the edge of the small lake system, where there were many little-known water access points. This made the cabin an ideal temporary stop for someone wanting to hide or prepare for further movement by water. The investigation team proceeded to review the cabin records. It had once been owned by a hunter who lived in the forest from 1947 to 1959. After the owner left, the cabin was not re-registered by anyone, but was not forcibly demolished because it was in a remote forest area with little impact. However, from 1960 onward, many people had temporarily used the cabin for overnight stays before hunting or fishing. This opened the possibility that the cabin still had occasional visitors around the time close to Owen's disappearance. When the cabin was thoroughly examined, the investigation team compiled all the details: marks resembling small child footprints, wooden stick with signs of breaking or light impact, dust wiped in the shape of an object that had been there long then recently moved, fabric scrap caught on the window edge, lightly compressed soil near the back of the cabin, located on a route that someone intending water movement could pass through. These factors were not enough to conclude the cabin was directly related to Owen, but taken together, they created a new investigative focus. The cabin was in exactly the position fitting the hypothesis of an adult carrying a child, avoiding traces, then shifting to another movement route. There was no strong physical evidence like clothing, papers, or personal items belonging to Owen, but the cabin contained enough unusual traces to not be ignored. The command team therefore decided to place the cabin on the list of primary investigative points, one of the locations needing deeper forensic analysis. They requested samples of wood, dust, fabric, as well as a heat map of possible movement routes from the cabin to the nearest water access points. A group of veteran rangers was mobilized to survey every connection point between the cabin and the small lake system, to determine if there was any natural path once used as an efficient short route between forest and water. As the scattered pieces were placed side by side, the cabin became the center of a new hypothesis. It may have been a temporary stop before Owen or someone carrying Owen left the area via a route the search team had not yet fully explored. And from here, the investigation began shifting from the procedure for a lost child to the procedure for tracing evidence of a more organized act. When the abandoned cabin was added to the list of suspicious locations requiring focused analysis, the investigation team went back to meticulously review the witness statements collected in the first 24 hours. Among the scattered pieces of information, 3 independent statements stood out because they all mentioned the appearance of a green pickup truck in the area at a time very close to when Owen vanished. All 3 statements came from people living in different parts of the neighborhood who did not know each other and had not exchanged information before giving their statements. The consistency in the description led the analysis team to immediately place this truck under verification. The witnesses described the truck with the same features: dark green color, old matte paint, long scratch marks on the rear door, single cab and long bed, styling from the late 1950s or early 1960s, small pickup generation. One witness saw the truck moving slowly on the main dirt road leading into the neighborhood. Another witness saw the truck parked briefly at the intersection between the dirt road and the trail leading into the forest. The third witness saw the truck leaving the area in the opposite direction, a few minutes after the search teams began arriving in the afternoon of the disappearance day. The time gaps between these 3 sightings were relatively close, enough to form a sequence of unusual movement. The vehicle analysis team entered the description into the Marion County vehicle registration records. However, the partial license plate one witness remembered did not exist in the system. When checking similar variations, still no matches were found. The recorded numbers and letters deviated from all official records in the 2 years prior to that time. In rural areas, unregistered vehicles or use of old plates were possible, but the complete lack of any matching identification raised the truck to a higher level of suspicion. Someone wanting to avoid attention entirely could deliberately use an invalid plate. From the 3 witness statements, the investigation team reconstructed the truck's movement route map. When marking the sighting points on the map, the team noticed a strange pattern. The truck moved around the neighborhood in a semicircle, but not a complete loop. It stopped at positions with no clear purpose. The distances between stops were short enough to indicate the truck was not just passing through, but may have been observing the area. In suspect behavior analysis of child disappearance cases, this semicircular movement pattern often appears when someone is monitoring a target area or waiting for the right moment to approach without drawing attention. To strengthen the investigative direction, the team revisited the tire tracks discovered near the forest edge on the first search day. Those tracks had not been prioritized at the time because the area saw many vehicles coming in for the search. However, with the information about the green truck emerging, the tire tracks became an important part of the evidence chain. The technical team returned to the scene, evaluating the residual tire marks, depth, distance between tracks, tread pattern, and turning angle. Though the marks had been affected by wind and search team footsteps, enough remained for typing. The tread pattern matched common pickup tires of that era, with V-shaped grooves and depth characteristic of light-duty tires. When compared to factory tire samples from 1958 to 1963, the technical team identified 3 possible matching patterns. These patterns were mainly fitted to small and mid-size pickups, matching the type described by the 3 witnesses. This helped reinforce the hypothesis that the tire tracks at the forest edge likely came from the green truck seen in the neighborhood. The water route sweep team also provided important data. While checking water access points around Blue Sink, they discovered a small patch of ground compressed in a way consistent with receiving heavy weight. The mark shape resembled vehicle parking or a small boat hull. This patch was not at an official water access and saw little use. Though not conclusive, its location lay on a route that could connect the cabin trail water, forming a logical chain if the person taking Owen intended to avoid crowded areas. Another detail strengthening suspicion about the truck was its movement direction. The first sighting was on the dirt road leading to the forest edge. The final sighting was on the road heading away from the neighborhood center, where there were fewer homes and many unfinished road sections. If someone wanted to leave the area unnoticed, this was a logical route. Combined with the direction where the footprints vanished and the movement model toward water, the green truck's appearances fit the behavior of an individual who was prepared, moving with purpose, and avoiding ground traces. The investigation team cross-referenced lists of green pickups in the 3 bordering counties, Marion, Lake, and Volusia. Those with long beds and old matte paint were circled for contacting owners or former users. Some owners still had the vehicles, some had sold or abandoned them, but most had valid plates. Unregistered vehicles in the past 2 years were examined more deeply, forming a list of about 15 trucks to check. In parallel, the psychological analysis team evaluated the possible connection between the cabin and the truck. The cabin could be accessed by boat from 3 small water branches, and also by vehicle if the driver knew the old forest roads once used by hunters in previous decades. The cabin's small child traces and signs of a recently moved object led the investigation team to consider the possibility that the cabin was used as a temporary stop before continuing movement by truck or boat. All the data points were compiled into the overall investigation map. Footprints leading to the loss point. Sock location. Cabin 1.7 miles into the forest. Compression marks near the water. Tire tracks at the forest edge. And 3 sightings of the green truck in the neighborhood. When connected, the points formed a logical movement diagram for the behavior of an adult carrying a small child, moving through multiple environments to avoid detection. Though there was still no legally strong evidence, the coherent chain of data made the green pickup truck a central investigative factor, on par with the cabin and the water route. The next issue for the investigation team was to find out who was driving that truck on that afternoon and the purpose of its presence around the Owen home. As the pieces about the green pickup truck, the abandoned cabin, and the footprints in the forest began to form a complex movement pattern, the investigation team simultaneously screened human factors in the area. Within a radius of less than half a mile around the Owen home, only one man with a criminal record was noted in Marion County files: Frank Delaney, a neighbor living across the dirt road leading into the neighborhood. His presence in the area at the time Owen vanished made him the first name to be evaluated under the suspect screening process. Frank was an old machine repairman, living alone in a rundown wooden house. Records showed he had been arrested for disorderly conduct and a minor theft at a small store in town a few years earlier. There were no serious convictions involving violence, but the investigation team had to check every possibility in the immediate vicinity. Frank's prior offenses were not directly related to children, but his proximity to the scene combined with a history of unstable behavior placed him on the priority review list. The investigation team approached Frank's property to assess the living environment and collect any signs that might be relevant. Around the house, there were no indications of recent vehicle traffic, no secondary paths leading to the forest behind, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves undisturbed. This suggested the area was not a movement route for any vehicle, especially the green pickup truck. Before conducting a detailed evaluation, the investigation team checked whether Frank was home on the day of the disappearance and what he had been doing during the critical time frame. The information gathering team recorded statements from 2 neighbors living near Frank. They said they saw Frank in the yard that morning repairing an old lawnmower. Another person saw him standing on the porch around after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, close to the time Owen vanished. However, no one confirmed seeing Frank leave the house or enter the forest during the key window from 4:30 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Although these statements were not enough to rule out or confirm Frank's involvement, they indicated he may have been in the area at the time of the incident. The investigation team examined the ground behind Frank's house to compare with the footprints discovered in the forest. However, there were no footprint patterns here matching those found on the firmer soil where Owen's and the adult footprints ended. The soil behind Frank's house was too wet and soft. Any footprints left would have been clear. The lack of significant movement traces in the past 24 hours reinforced the assessment that this area was not on the suspected route. Another point that led to closer scrutiny of Frank was that he owned an old pickup truck. However, Frank's truck was brown, not green, as described by the 3 witnesses. His truck also lacked the long horizontal scratches on the bed that witnesses mentioned. More importantly, Frank did not drive away from the house on the day of the incident, according to confirmation from 2 people living near him. This reduced the connection between Frank's vehicle and the green truck seen around the Owen home. When checking inside Frank's house, the investigation team noted a cluttered environment, but no signs a small child had been present. There were no children's clothes, no toys, no food or items showing recent use by a child. A few old items in the house made the place seem long neglected, but nothing matched the evidence at the cabin or the discovered sock. The analysis continued as the investigation team checked whether Frank had access to the abandoned cabin. The cabin was deep in the forest, more than 3 kilometers of trail from Frank's house. There was no evidence Frank had ever taken that route. The shoes he owned did not produce tread or footprint patterns matching those found in the forest. Additionally, Frank had chronic back pain according to old medical records, making it highly unlikely he could carry a child and travel a long distance over rough terrain. The investigation team also screened whether Frank had ever owned a small boat or engaged in activities on the lakes around Ocala. Local records showed no boat registration for him. Neighbors also confirmed Frank did not fish or have a habit of going to the lakes. Meanwhile, the investigative direction involving the possibility of Owen being taken by boat was becoming increasingly important. This made any connection between Frank and the water route virtually non-existent. After analyzing all the data, the investigation team created a preliminary evaluation table of how well Frank matched the event chain. Proximity to the scene, yes. Presence at the time of disappearance, unclear but possible. Criminal history, yes, but not related to children. Vehicle, no match. Ability to access cabin, low no loss. Ability to access water entry points, lozo. Connection to footprints, no matchin'. Connection to physical evidence, no match play. Suspicious behavior per witnesses, none. The analysis results showed Frank did not meet any key indicators in the behavioral models associated with child disappearances involving adult intervention. Although he had a record and lived near the incident location, the remaining factors did not form a clear link to Owen's disappearance. The timing overlaps were merely coincidental and lacked strong physical basis to keep him on the suspect list. Therefore, Frank Delaney was cleared from active suspicion, but his file was retained in the passive monitoring category in case new data emerged. Eliminating Frank from the shortlist allowed the investigation team to focus more on the elements becoming prominent: the cabin in the forest, the abruptly ending footprints, and the green pickup truck that appeared at the critical moment. As the investigative directions converged on the complex movement pattern from the backyard into the forest, through the cabin, and then possible water access, the investigation team began reviewing documents compiled in the first 2 days of the search for any clues that might have been overlooked. This process aimed to identify details previously not prioritized but now holding significant meaning as the event chain became clearer. While sorting through each document one by one, they discovered a strange record. A preliminary report written by a deputy on the first shift in the afternoon of July 14, 1965, but never appearing in the official file. This document was found in a loose stack of papers, clipped behind the case folder cover, not included in the digitized records or the copies submitted to the criminal archives. The handwritten report had faded ink, but the content was still readable. The deputy noted that during the initial sweep around the forest edge area, before the K9 search team even arrived, he heard a sound like an engine fading away toward the southeast. The recorded time, marked by his wristwatch, was approximately 4:57 in the afternoon, almost exactly matching the moment the family reported not finding Owen. The deputy described not being able to identify the engine type because the sound was very faint, partially muffled by the forest wind. He did not immediately go check because his priority task at the time was defining the scene perimeter and assisting Owen's parents. The report further noted that the sound did not resemble a car on the dirt road because there was no dust rising, and no gravel kicking sounds like when a vehicle drives on a gravel surface, indicating the sound might come from a vehicle not in direct contact with the ground. This detail, if included in the compiled file from the start, would have held special significance in light of the evidence gathered in the following days. The vehicle compression marks near the water, any compression, the FAR WWW, tire tracks at the forest edge, witness statements about a small engine sound on the lake, and the boat movement model. However, the report never appeared in the official file, so no unit received or analyzed this detail while the case was still hot. When examining why the report was not included, the records management team concluded it could be an administrative error occurring during emergency processing. The first shift had to work at high speed, recording many types of information, and preliminary screening might have missed this note when the daily report was compiled. Another possibility was that the deputy thought the report was still in draft form and had not submitted the official version. Whatever the cause, the overlooked record meant critical information was not passed to the main investigation team during the decisive phase. The investigation team cross-referenced the report's timing with the collected evidence. The 4:57 mark aligned with the estimated time the child and adult footprints ended on the firmer ground. It also matched the moment one witness saw the green truck leaving the forest area in the opposite direction. When piecing these data points together, the possibility that Owen was removed from the forest area not many hours after disappearance as initially assumed, but within just minutes after leaving, parental sight became far more convincing. If the sound the deputy heard was a small boat engine, it indicated the perpetrator had prepared the vehicle in advance, either by hiding the boat at a secluded water access or using a little-known approach. The southeast direction also matched the water branches leading from the neighborhood edge to Blue Sink and the surrounding small streams. This further reinforced the movement model the water search team was analyzing. The forgotten report became a crucial piece because it was the earliest evidence suggesting Owen's departure from the forest area might have been earlier than all prior assumptions. The K9 trail loss, sock location, interrupted footprints, cabin in the forest, and green truck appearances all indicated complex movement. This report pointed to another vehicle, possibly intervening very early. The investigation team added the report to the supplemental file with a special note. This information, if surfaced at the right time, could have directed the search toward water routes in the very first hours. Its omission caused the investigation at the time to drag on in the lost child direction, rather than the direction of someone removing the child from the area by vehicle. This was not a sign of negligence, but a consequence of less rigorous administrative procedures in that era, especially when local police had to handle a complex case under limited conditions. Once the report was recovered, the investigation team had to re-examine the entire timeline again, focusing on the 4:45 to 5:05 afternoon window. The compiled results showed that if an engine was indeed operating at the forest boundary at that exact moment, the likelihood Owen was taken out of the forest area before the K9 team arrived was very high. This changed the prioritization of subsequent investigative routes and strengthened the hypothesis of organized intervention by an adult. After the earliest information about the disappearance was compiled, including the deputy's forgotten report and the initial physical evidence, the investigation team continued pursuing every possible lead throughout 1965 and the early part of 1966. However, no new clues emerged. The forest cabins were swept multiple times over many months, and aside from the first cabin with a few inconclusive traces, no other cabin showed any sign a child had been present. All water access points around Blue Sink and the secondary branches were repeatedly searched, but nothing was found. No boat, no discarded items, no physical traces related to Owen. In the subsequent investigation phase, the Marion County Sheriff's Office began examining potential suspects outside the neighborhood, including individuals with histories of violence, those linked to child disappearances in neighboring counties, and people who had worked in the forest. Though the initial list was long, none of them had timing or location overlaps with the day Owen vanished. The possible movement routes of the green pickup truck could not be further identified because no witnesses outside the neighborhood provided relevant information, and the dirt roads at the time were too sparse to have cameras or any objective recordings. The physical evidence collected from the forest, the sock, the broken wooden stick, the fabric scrap caught on the cabin window edge, was sealed, according to procedures of the era, and placed in the county evidence locker. However, 1965 forensic technology could not analyze DNA, could not extract dead skin cells, and had no techniques for trace recovery on fabric, wood, or dust, like in later decades. All the evidence became unsolvable pieces. In the absence of modern analytical tools, the investigation team relied mainly on witness statements, footprints, and behavioral comparisons elements that had already yielded no results at the time. Months of continuous searching brought no progress, and the investigation team gradually had to scale back operations. Manpower was reassigned to other cases, and Owen's disappearance entered passive monitoring status. The years from 1967 to 1970 saw very little change in the case file. Some scattered tips from the public claimed they had seen a child resembling Owen in towns dozens of miles away, But every time the investigation team followed up, the age, features, or circumstances never matched. From 1970 to 1975, the case file was reopened 3 times at the request of new deputies, but each time ended the same way. No new evidence, no new witnesses, no viable suspect identified. The possible water movement routes could not be further confirmed because many old boat landings had been closed, and the boats operating in 1965 no longer existed or no longer had their original owners to trace. This period also recorded a major challenge in evidence storage and preservation. The county evidence locker used box and paper bag storage methods, but Florida's high humidity affected many items over time. Clues like fabric scraps, wood dust, or faint stains on the cabin surfaces could not be processed in any way because there were no techniques to analyze composition or compare traces. Fingerprint technology of that era was also very limited. Rough surfaces like cabin wood or dust-covered fabric could not retain usable prints. From 1975 to the end of the 1970s, the case fell into a state of almost no progress. The deputies who had been involved from the beginning started retiring or transferring. The case documents were moved multiple times through different storage facilities. In the process, the initial incomplete categorization led to some reports being misplaced or incorrectly labeled, just like the original overlooked record. Although the main physical evidence was still properly preserved, the supporting documents became fragmented and no longer fully reflected the logic of the entire initial investigation phase. Even though new personnel in the 1980s showed interest in reopening the file, they faced the same limitations. No DNA technology, no national data connection system, and no resources to trace vehicles or individuals who had been in the area 15 years earlier. The soil samples, fabric samples, and footprints no longer held value for modern analysis. Tire tracks could not be compared because vehicle models from the 1960s had been completely phased out. The cabin in the forest gradually rotted away, and after just a few heavy rain seasons, many of the original traces were lost forever. All these factors turned the Owen Harris case into a truly cold file. No new clues, no new witnesses appeared, and no scientific method existed that could identify the man who had left footprints next to Owen's. The case was closed, like many other disappearances of that era, full of suspicion, lacking answers, and constrained by forensic technology that was still far too primitive. The file was placed in Marion County long-term storage, marked unsolved, shifted to passive retention status while awaiting some future technological breakthrough, a development no one at the time could predict would arrive many decades later. By 2024, nearly 6 decades after the day Owen Harris disappeared, the case file lay deep in the Marion County storage archives. When the county launched a program to digitize all old records to bring unsolved cases into the modern search system, the team in charge had to open every evidence box, scan every document page, and re-examine the accompanying physical items. Many storage containers from the 1960s had deteriorated due to humidity, making the sorting process more difficult than expected. It was during this procedure that an old, yellowed, sealed envelope clipped to the back of a large file folder was discovered. The envelope bore the sealing standard of 1965 for the county, a faded signature of the duty deputy at the time, and the date written in marker that had faded. What stood out was that the envelope was not listed in the official evidence inventory for the case. The label on the outside only had a short line, "Collected near forest boundary, day 1. This description did not appear in any of the scene reports that had been digitized in earlier phases. When the envelope was opened under modern forensic procedure, the analysis team discovered 3 pieces of evidence inside: a light-colored children's sweater, a small piece of cloth, and a child's fingernail clipping, each placed in separate paper sleeves. All the items were wrapped in their original wax paper, never opened or disturbed since the day they were collected. The fact that these items never appeared in the main records was a serious administrative error from the earlier era, but conversely, this very oversight had unintentionally preserved them better. The forgotten envelope sat untouched in a sealed box for decades, never handled, never opened multiple times. never directly exposed to light or the storage humidity like the other evidence. This left all three items in ideal condition for modern analytical techniques, something no one in 1965 could have imagined would matter in the future. The children's sweater was the right size for a 3-year-old Owen. The fabric had faded but showed no rot. There were no special identifying marks beyond the common weave pattern of that time. The cloth piece had no pattern and was torn along one edge, possibly once a handkerchief or part of a larger fabric item. Most important was the fingernail clipping, small but with intact keratin structure, indicating it could contain enough residual DNA for 21st century processing. The analysis team immediately separated the three items into individual case files and sent them to a partnered lab specializing in aged evidence. The goal was to determine if any dead skin cells, sweat, or biological material remained on the fabric or in the fingernail. Since the items had never been opened since 1965, the risk of cross-contamination from investigators of that era was far lower than with evidence handled multiple times. Before proceeding with testing, the specialist group reviewed the entire timeline to assess the potential value of each item. The sweater was collected near forest boundary on day 1, according to the envelope label. This matched the K9 trail loss point and the location where both the child and adult footprints ended. If the sweater belonged to Owen, it could have fallen while the child was being carried away. The collection location near the forest edge also aligned with the footprint sequence endpoint. This made the sweater a potentially critical piece for establishing events right before Owen was removed from the area. The cloth piece carried different significance. With no clear origin, it might belong to the person who took Owen or to something inside the cabin. If it carried adult skin cells, it could become the link to identifying the person who left the footprints beside Owen, something completely impossible in 1965. The fingernail clipping was the most important item. If it was Owen's, DNA confirmation would create a baseline for comparison with samples from suspects who emerged decades later. But if the clipping belonged to an adult instead of Owen, it would open a new investigative direction. The person who left the nail might have carried, held, or had direct contact with the child. When evaluating the evidence, the forensic group determined all items were sufficiently intact for modern DNA analysis, including decoding trace biological material through advanced cell extraction processes. Although the technology requires only minute amounts of DNA, success still depended on the samples not being degraded by heat, humidity, or mold. The never-opened envelope significantly increased the chances of success. Before sending the samples out, the investigation team updated the trace map. The collection location noted on the envelope matched the area they had long believed was where Owen was lifted off the ground. That forest section had changed over time, but old archived data allowed reconstruction of the 1965 terrain. Analyzing the sweater drop location provided a direct link between the original scene reconstruction limited by the technology of its day and the likely actual sequence of events. The discovery of the 1965 envelope became the first turning point in the modern phase of the investigation. For the first time since the case went cold, the team had evidence in pristine enough condition to apply next-generation forensic DNA technology, something that did not exist in 1965. Traces once considered worthless at the time now held the potential to deliver results the investigators of decades earlier could never have achieved. When the three pieces of evidence from the 1965 sealed envelope were sent to the partnering lab, the analysts immediately began assessing the feasibility of DNA recovery. The fingernail clipping was prioritized first, because keratin has the ability to preserve epidermal cells beneath the surface, creating conditions for DNA extraction even after decades. After cleaning the sample under strict contamination control protocols, the cell extraction team started the process of dissolving the keratin tissue with specific enzymes, a step that exposes DNA from the hard nail structure. The initial results were strikingly unexpected. Instead of a single DNA profile as in most child fingernail samples, the analyzer revealed two distinct sets of genetic markers. One set belonged to a chromosome pattern consistent with a prepubescent child, with low methylation levels characteristic of young tissue. The second set displayed biological markers, indicating origin from an adult male, with demethylation temperatures and DNA fragment lengths matching adult signatures. The discovery of two different DNA profiles in the same fingernail clipping was a significant indicator. This could occur in two scenarios. Either the nail belonged to Owen, but contained adult skin cells from strong contact, grasping, carrying, holding, or the clipping was a combination of Owen's nail and a fragment from another person due to impact. In either case, the result was direct evidence that an adult man had close enough and forceful enough contact to leave DNA on the child's nail. The child's DNA set was cleanly separated from the adult DNA using specialized classification algorithms. Based on the allele structure, the analysis team confirmed this was a DNA signature matching a 3-year-old boy. The completeness of the marker set also allowed construction of a full genetic profile representing Owen Harris as a child. Having Owen's DNA profile from 1965 was the key to comparing against any individual suspected later, especially those appearing without documentation, without birth records, or identified under new names. The second DNA set, the adult profile, was analyzed in greater depth. The profile indicated male gender, with genetic ancestry consistent with European structure, mixed with a small proportion of Appalachian region genes, a trait common in families long established in the southeastern United States. The DNA did not match any individual in CODIS, the National DNA Database. This meant the man who left the DNA had never been arrested, never tested in other cases, or belonged to the group who died before CODIS was widely implemented. From the lack of a CODIS match, the analysts provided an initial assessment of likely subject groups. 1. A man with no criminal record, or who had never been DNA sampled. 2. A person who lived before the CODIS era, possibly deceased in the 1980s or 1990s. 3. An anonymous individual, possibly living outside civil registration systems or highly mobile. 4. Someone with genetic traits from the southeastern U.S., consistent with Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee. The forensic analysis team continued extracting residual DNA from the sweater and cloth piece. The sweater showed DNA traces matching Owen, confirming the garment belonged to the boy. This strengthened the hypothesis that the sweater fell at the forest boundary right as he was lifted off the ground. The cloth piece showed very faint adult DNA traces, less than on the nail, but still sharing the same genetic markers from that male individual. This indicated the interaction between Owen and the man was not a single instance but possibly occurred over a short but continuous period, while the subject used the cloth to cover, wipe, or carry items related to the child. When the three items were analyzed together, the forensic team reconstructed the DNA distribution model across each piece. Results showed the adult male DNA appeared at higher density around the nail clipping edge, meaning the man likely touched or tightly gripped Owen's hand. The lower DNA distribution on the cloth suggested indirect contact or use of the cloth as an auxiliary item. There was no adult DNA on the sweater, indicating it may have fallen off Owen during movement rather than being actively removed. From this data, the investigation team concluded the contact between Owen and the man occurred very close to the forest boundary, matching the footprint endpoint. The fingernail containing two DNA sets further reinforced the likelihood Owen resisted, or was at least restrained, while the subject carried or pulled him away. This was the first evidence in the entire case showing direct, intentional physical contact between Owen and an adult male on the day he vanished. The most difficult part was, the man's DNA could not be matched to any criminal database. CODIS, the National DNA Storage System, was built in the 1990s and primarily includes profiles from serious offenders arrested or convicted in the modern era. An individual living outside the system, or someone who died before mandatory DNA collection, would have no record in CODIS. This forced the investigation team to shift toward forensic genealogy, a technique requiring a complete DNA profile like the one they had just built. Nevertheless, identifying two independent DNA sets, one Owen's and one from an unidentified man, completely shattered the decades-long hypothesis that Owen simply wandered off. The case officially shifted from the child missing in the wild model to child taken by an adult. The fingernail clipping, tiny and forgotten for nearly 60 years, became the strongest evidence that Owen did not leave the area alone, and that the identity of this mysterious man, unknown male, was the key to unlocking the entire story. Once the UN noun male DNA profile was fully constructed, the investigation team understood that identifying this individual could not rely on CODIS. This was a DNA sample from an adult male who lived before the era of widespread DNA collection and had no existing criminal record in official databases. The only way to trace his identity was through forensic genetic genealogy, comparing the DNA to public databases where people voluntarily submit genealogy testing data. The unidentified DNA profile was reformatted into a marker set compatible with GEDmatch and family tree DNA structures. When uploaded to GEDmatch, the system took nearly 2 hours to analyze the genetic data and produce a list of possible genetic relatives. Because the DNA was tied to a criminal case, the profile was flagged for law enforcement, allowing expanded tracing within legal limits. When the screen returned the first results, the analysis team immediately noticed a standout feature. The unknown male profile connected to numerous distant relatives scattered across southeastern U.S. states, especially Alabama, Georgia, northern Florida, and some smaller branches appearing as far as the Florida Keys. These connections were not close relations, like father, uncle, or siblings, but ranged from third cousin to fifth cousin, far enough that no specific individual could be pinpointed immediately, yet close enough to identify the ancestral lineage. From there, the genealogist team built a reverse family tree. Each genetically linked person was added to the list and analyzed for connecting branches. As the tree expanded, a pattern gradually emerged. Most individuals connected to one known male belonged to 2 major family lines originating in Alabama, later dispersing into northern Florida, with some members migrating to the swamps and coastal areas of the Florida Keys between the 1940s and 1970s. The deeper they dug into the genealogy, the more the analysis team recognized geographic overlaps with evidence from the field investigation. The cabin in Ocala Forest, water access routes to small lakes, and the hypothesis that the person who took Owen had ties to the southeastern United States. The family lines in the tree were heavily concentrated in areas with traditional occupations like hunting, fishing, and forest labor, people familiar with navigating complex terrain and using small boats. To narrow the scope, the genealogist team focused on the 3 main branches with the highest number of distant matches. One branch had a history of living in Alabama until around the 1950s, before part of the family moved near Silver Springs, Florida. Another branch lived along the Florida Keys coast during the peak fishing era. The third branch moved seasonally between Alabama and Florida's forested regions for work. These branches formed a looping genealogical structure, members leaving and returning across decades, leaving geographic traces consistent with the perpetrator behavior pattern recorded in Owen's evidence chain. During the tree-building process, one specific surname stood out above the others: Maddox. This family had a multi-generation history in Alabama, followed by members moving to Florida in the 1960s, the exact period of Owen's disappearance. When the data was layered, the name Maddox appeared across multiple branches of the relationship map, proving it was the surname with the strongest genetic connection to one known male. From the list of Maddox individuals who lived in Florida between 1950 and 1975, the genealogist team created a short list of those whose geographic records overlapped with the suspected routes. People who lived or worked near Ocala National Forest, Silver Glen Springs, Blue Sink, or waterways connected to forest cabins. When filtered by gender and age appropriate for an adult in 1965, the list narrowed to just 5 people. Among those 5 names, one appeared repeatedly in Ocala area civil records: George Maddox. This man had lived near Ocala in the early 1960s, then left without a recorded destination. Housing records showed he once rented a cabin on the forest edge, located on a route that could connect to the abandoned cabin 1.7 miles from the Owen home. An old employment record noted George had short-term work in the Florida Keys, aligning with genealogical traces showing some distant relatives of UN noun male had lived in that region. Another detail that made George Maddox stand out: he was recorded as using a small boat to travel between forest lakes. This matched the investigative direction, suggesting Owen may have been removed from the area by boat in the very short window after losing parental sight. The flexible movement pattern by both land and water was a key behavioral trait of people living in the Ocala forest at that time, but George's records showed he was particularly familiar with many unofficial water access points, something seen in only a handful of local residents, or those living a transient forest lifestyle. When cross-referencing genealogical information with case evidence, the analysis team found significant overlaps. The Maddox lineage linked consistently across Alabama, North Florida, Florida Keys. The UN-known male allele set matched multiple branches within the Maddox family. This lineage had a history of forest labor, hunting, and fishing consistent with the perpetrator's multi-route movement model. George Maddox lived in Ocala at the exact time of Owen's disappearance and had access to deep forest areas. There was no conclusive proof yet, but George Maddox emerging at the intersection of genealogical data, geographic location, and field behavior made him the first individual in nearly 60 years considered potentially directly linked to Owen Harris's disappearance. On this basis, the investigation team shifted focus to reconstructing George Maddox's life timeline, verifying residences, workplaces, forest activities, and points he might have used as movement routes in 1965. This was the first time since the 1960s that the case had a specific individual rising from forensic data rather than from speculation or scattered witness statements. Right after the name George Maddox emerged prominently in the genealogical DNA analysis, the investigation team focused on re-examining all civil records, residency files, employment history, and movement patterns of his from 1955 to 1975 to determine the degree of overlap with the context of Owen Harris's disappearance. The scattered documents from the 1960s, once not prioritized without DNA data, now became crucial when recombined through a forensic lens. Old records from the Florida Land Management Agency noted that Maddox had rented a small cabin on the edge of Ocala National Forest from 1963 until early summer 1965. The cabin he rented was less than 2 miles by forest path from the abandoned cabin the investigation team had discovered. Although this cabin no longer exists today, 1960s maps confirm its location, lay directly on a logical movement route between the trail loss point at the forest boundary and the water access points leading to Blue Sink. The rental records showed Maddox had unstable employment, sometimes registered as a hunting guide, sometimes seasonal fishing, sometimes day labor at a small boat maintenance station near Silver Glen Springs. This aligned with the genealogical DNA pattern indicating the man who left the DNA belonged to a lineage scattered between Alabama and Florida regions with traditions in forest and boating occupations. Living alone in the cabin, without official permanent residency beyond short-term paperwork, also made Maddox the type of person who could move easily without leaving much administrative trace. The next key factor was the timing of Maddox leaving Ocala. According to the cabin rental log, he returned the cabin on July 15, 1965, just 1 day after Owen vanished. Records noted Maddox ended the rental earlier than planned, without specifying a reason. This suspiciously matched the case timeline. The only subsequent record of Maddox was information that he left Ocala on a shared rented truck heading south toward coastal Florida. The investigation team also found information from a 1965 forest ranger note. They had encountered Maddox at one of the little-used water access points and recorded the registration of his small outboard boat. Maddox's boat was a traditional John boat light, flat-bottomed, especially suited to shallow waters and swamps, the exact type of vessel hypothesized to have been used to remove Owen from the forest area. Though the boat no longer exists for examination, its records strengthened suspicion that Maddox may have used water movement on the day Owen disappeared. When the investigation team expanded searches to records outside Florida, they uncovered a notable incident in Alabama in the early 1960s. Maddox had been questioned regarding a temporarily missing small child, reported at a roadside market. The child was found a few hours later in a busy shopping area, unharmed and with no clear memory of what happened. Maddox was considered the last person to see the child because he was recorded talking to the mother at a stall when the incident occurred. However, with no specific evidence and the child not confirming being taken, Maddox was released without charges. The case file was brief but recorded in the Alabama police system, as an interaction with minor case closed. For the 2024 investigation team, this incident was not conclusive, but still a notable precedent, as it showed Maddox had once appeared in a situation potentially involving a temporarily missing small child. When placed alongside the genealogical DNA data and Maddox's cabin location in Ocala, the level of suspicion increased. Another factor emerged when the investigation team reviewed tax documents and employment records. Maddox had no stable work history with any agency or business after 1965. Tax records showed unusually long gaps in income, filled only by small earnings from seasonal fishing and scattered day labor. This fit the lifestyle pattern of someone transient, constantly moving through forest and water regions without leaving clear civil traces. For the Owen case, this movement style made Maddox particularly suited to taking a child far away unnoticed. When expanding searches to other Florida counties, the investigation team confirmed Maddox had been recorded in the Florida Keys in 1967, working as a boat repair assistant. This detail matched the lineage ties to the Florida Keys, a genetic factor that appeared in the genealogical DNA results. In the following 2 years, Maddox continued living scattered across Florida water regions before his records vanished completely in the early 1970s. One point the investigation team paid special attention to was physical descriptions in Alabama and Florida records from that era. Maddox was taller than average, around 5 feet, 11 to 6 feet, shoe size 11 to 12, sturdy build, matching the adult footprint size found next to Owen's. The footprint size match alone was not conclusive, but in the context of no other fitting suspects, this detail further tied Maddox to the expanded evidence chain. When reconstructing Maddox's movements in the week of Owen's disappearance, the investigation team saw that he was present in Ocala, living in a forest cabin, had water access means, was familiar with the terrain, and had a prior history involving a child. After Owen's disappearance, Maddox left the area the very next day and never returned. His subsequent movement led through other forest areas and then to the Florida Keys, a significant overlap with the distant relatives branches in the genealogical DNA system. All the data, from multiple sources, genealogy, geography, occupation, footprints, vehicle, departure timing, and behavior in another state when placed together formed a clear picture of an individual fitting every element of a high-probability perpetrator who removed Owen from the area on the afternoon of July 14, 1965. Since Maddox had died in 1983, according to a death record, in a small coastal town, direct DNA sampling was impossible. However, the genealogical DNA was sufficient to prove the UN known male profile matched the Maddox lineage. When comparing Maddox's life timeline to all the case data, he became the strongest suspect in nearly 6 decades since Owen Harris's disappearance. With these results, the investigation team moved to the next step, searching for remaining traces of Maddox, including his old cabin, the water access points he used, and any physical evidence that might have persisted from 1965 to the present. As the genealogical DNA analysis team delved deeper into the family branches connected to the UN noun male DNA profile, they began to notice complex linkages extending beyond the Maddox lineage. Many distant relatives from the Maddox branch still appeared prominently, but a smaller separate cluster emerged on the periphery, belonging to individuals with Hispanic surnames, yet sharing a significant portion of alleles with the Alabama branch. This drew attention because civil records from the 1930s to 1960s showed almost no clear intermixing between those two genetic groups in the region. As the tree was expanded further, a small but consistent branch began to emerge. A group of distant relatives sharing a common paternal ancestor who lived in the Mobile, Alabama area during the 1920s to 1930s. From this group, the genetic genealogist discovered a faint but meaningful link leading to another surname, Ruiz. The unusual aspect was that this Ruiz branch had no deep information before 1974. Prior to that year, the system recorded no individuals in the Ruiz branch with close genetic ties to the Maddox lineage or any other Anglo-Appalachian families. Yet, the DNA records confirmed a clear genetic relationship between UN known male and the Ruiz branch at the 3rd to 4th cousin level. The analysis team began examining each Ruiz record that matched DNA with UN noun male. Most were low-resolution distant matches, but one name stood out above the rest. Michael Ruiz, 63 years old, residing in Central Florida. His DNA profile appeared in GEDmatch from a recreational genealogy test, and the matching level with UN noun male was significantly higher than other individuals in the Ruiz file. The relationship between the two DNA sets fell in the range of third cousin once removed, strong enough to warrant examining a deeper connection in the family tree. However, what made Michael Ruiz the focal point was not the matching level, but the unexplained gap in his life records. All civil data only documented his existence from 1974 onward. Before 1974, there was no birth certificate, no school records, no immigration traces, no registrations of any kind. There was not a single line indicating he existed before age 14. When the investigation team checked social and tax records, the strange pattern became even clearer. His social security number was issued in 1974, at an unusually late age compared to standard practice. His first recorded address was a mobile home area near Gainesville, where he self-reported as moving from another state. No adoption records matched his demographic information. There was no legal evidence he was born in the U.S. Yet he still obtained an SSN and accepted civil documents. These characteristics led the investigation team to suspect Michael's identity as Ruiz had been newly created around 1974. During the deeper genealogy digging, the genealogists noticed a critical detail. Michael Ruiz's DNA not only matched unknown male, but also matched the Maddox lineage, the original suspect branch in the Owen case. This indicated Ruiz had a genetic connection to the Maddox line, at least at the third cousin level or closer. He was not just a distant match. He stood at the central intersection between two genetic branches, Maddox and Ruiz. This raised a major question. Why would someone with a genetic tie to the Maddox family have no records at all before 1974? The investigation team attempted to trace where Michael Ruiz lived between 1974 and 1985. Former neighbors described him as quiet, minimally social, often doing manual labor at boat docks and small repair shops. One person who lived near Ruiz said he was very at home on the water and frequently used a small boat for solo fishing, consistent with the behavioral pattern recorded for the Maddox lineage and the traits of the UN noun male suspect. Beyond that, when the investigation team searched locations Ruiz had lived, they discovered he rented a forest shack in 1976 in an area less than 5 miles from the cabin Maddox had once rented. Even more notably, Ruiz appeared in the Florida Keys during the 1980s, doing similar work to what Maddox had done 2 decades earlier. His movement traces stretched exactly along the path George Maddox had once taken, a pivotal detail that forced the investigators to reevaluate the entire family tree. When examining mutation pattern similarity between UN noun male and Michael Ruiz, the analysis team found the allele similarity level did not fit a simple third cousin relationship. Instead, it was closer to a parent-child match degraded by resolution loss due to time and allele dropout. Though not conclusive, it was enough to place Ruiz in the close relation category with UN known male, possibly son, nephew, or uncle called grandson. This opened a critical possibility. Michael Ruiz could be the next generation after George Maddox, born before or around the mid-1960s, then brought to Florida in a way that left no legal records or given a new identity while still young. When the investigation team traced Ruiz's records back through legal documents, they discovered a 1974 school enrollment form with the note, "Student transferred without previous records." This was rare, as most children had educational records from elementary school. The note stated prior records were unable to be retrieved, with no reason given. Additionally, Ruiz's vaccination records only began in 1974, inconsistent with a child born in the U.S. In the 1960s, when basic vaccination programs were already mandatory nationwide. This gap could only occur if the child did not use a legal identity until adolescence. When cross-referencing demographic data, the time Ruiz first appeared in Gainesville 1974 also matched the period when many in the Maddox lineage left the Florida Keys to move inland. This raised suspicion. Michael Ruiz did not begin his life in Gainesville. He only first appeared there under a new identity. The investigation team conducted a Miller Index comparison, a tool analyzing closeness between alleles of UN noun male and Ruiz. Results showed 36 to 42% similarity, higher than the 25% of uncle-nephew or grandfather-grandson relationships. This level suggested a father-son or half-sibling relationship, but obscured by allele dropout due to time and sample type. The possibility that UN known male could be Ruiz's biological father became a hypothesis needing verification. If Ruiz was truly the biological son of UN known male, then why did he carry the surname Ruiz? Why were there no records before 1974? And why did his DNA match just enough to avoid detection in ordinary checks? When reconstructing the family tree, the investigation team noticed a large gap in George Maddox's history from 1960 to 1965, the exact period he could have fathered a child. Ruiz was born around 1961 to 1962 according to medical record estimates, meaning he could fully be the next generation of Maddox, or the man from the Maddox branch. If so, Ruiz might carry the genetic footprint of the perpetrator without knowing anything about his true origins. The collection of evidence, no records before 1974. Late emerging identity. Movement overlapping Maddox's path. Abnormal DNA matching level made Michael Ruiz the central figure in the new phase of the case, not as the perpetrator, but as the genetic bridge leading to the true identity of unknown male in 1965. Ruiz was not just a distant match. He could be the only living piece of the family tree directly tied to Owen Harris's disappearance. After the genealogical DNA analyses indicated that Michael Ruiz was not just a distant relative but stood in a position with an abnormal level of genetic similarity to unknown male, the investigation team realized they needed to precisely determine this relationship using the only method that could provide a definitive conclusion: direct comparison of Ruiz's DNA with the DNA extracted from Owen's fingernail in 1965. However, collecting a DNA sample from an individual not directly linked to the legal record required a strict approval process. A formal request was submitted to the local court based on the genealogical evidence, the anomalies in Ruiz's civil records, and the suspicion that he carried a newly created identity. When the sample collection order was approved, the investigation team approached Ruiz through standard procedure, taking a buccal swab and a small blood sample to ensure high accuracy in comparison. The samples were immediately transferred to the partnering DNA lab. The technical team prepared to extract Ruiz's genetic markers in a format compatible with Owen's DNA profile, the profile already built from the fingernail found in the 1965 sealed envelope. Since Owen's DNA profile was relatively complete, including over 20 CODIS markers, along with deep genealogical segments, the lab could conduct the comparison analysis in 3 layers. 1. CODIS match to determine parent-child, sibling, or identical individual relationships. 2. Segment analysis, comparing allele overlap across long stretches. 3. Autozygosity test, measuring the number of fully identical segments to confirm identity. When the first layer of analysis was complete, the screen displayed results the technicians had never anticipated at this level. The similarity between Ruiz's DNA and Owen's DNA was nearly absolute. The genetic markers fell within the range consistent with one-to-one identity, meaning the 2 DNA samples belonged to the same individual, not parent-child or full siblings. This was virtually impossible if Ruiz were merely a descendant of Maddox. The match level completely ruled out all other possibilities. The second layer, segment analysis, confirmed this even more clearly. Long allele segments matched perfectly across chains of 12 to 18 centimorgans without any mutation, drift, or allele dropout characteristic of distant relatives. Owen's DNA sample from the 1965 fingernail and Ruiz's DNA matched segment by segment with near absolute precision, something that only occurs when 2 samples come from the same original genome. The third layer, autozygosity, was the analysis used to determine if 2 DNA sets belong to the same person at different points in time. In children, accumulated mutations with age are typically very small and do not alter core DNA structure. When the software scanned the entire genome, results showed all autozygous segments from Owen appeared intact in Ruiz's DNA profile, with no segments missing or altered, the hallmark of a person born with that DNA and carrying it throughout life. This led to the only conclusion forensic genetics could reach. Michael Ruiz and Owen Harris are the same person. In other words, Ruiz is Owen Harris, the 3-year-old boy who vanished from the Ocala forest area on July 14, 1965. When the investigation team rechecked Ruiz's age in civil records, they found the number 63 perfectly matched Owen's actual age if he were still alive in 2024. Although Ruiz had no birth certificate, his first medical record from 1974 listed him as approximately 12 to 14 years old, matching Owen's age in 1974. The age alignment further reinforced the DNA conclusion. An additional comparison was performed by matching ear shape, nail ridge patterns, and morphological features from Ruiz's medical images against the childhood photos of Owen stored in documents the parents submitted in 1965. Ruiz's ears had a rare helix and antihelix structure, matching the trait visible in Owen's old photos, despite being blurry and hard to identify. The ratios of eye spacing, nose bridge length, and jaw angle all fell within the natural variation range for the same individual as an adult. When placing all the data into a comprehensive chart, the investigation team obtained a powerfully affirmative model. DNA, genetic traits, appearance, timeline, biological age, absence of records before 1974, and morphological matches showed that Owen Harris did not die. After disappearing, he lived for 6 decades under the name Michael Ruiz, though it still could not explain how Owen left Ocala, who took him, where he lived in the early years after disappearance, or why he received a new identity in 1974. The DNA results shifted the case into an entirely new phase. For nearly 60 years, investigators believed Owen had been taken from the forest by an adult man. Now, they knew that little boy had lived to age 63, under a different name, carrying a life no one could have imagined. Owen Harris, the child who vanished in the summer of 1965, is still alive. After confirming through direct DNA comparison that Michael Ruiz is indeed Owen Harris, the investigation team shifted to a critical task, aligning the entire movement timeline of George Maddox with the first appearances of Ruiz starting from 1965. The goal was to reconstruct Owen's journey out of Ocala and determine whether Maddox's timelines, the prime suspect, truly synchronized with Ruiz's emergence under a new identity. The process began by mapping every point where Maddox had lived, worked, or been recorded in civil records, employment files, ranger notes, and small boat permits during the 1960 to 1970 period. This data was once fragmented, but when reassembled along the new timeline supported by DNA and genealogical analysis, the previously meaningless points started forming a continuous chain. First point: Ocala National Forest, July 1965. Rental records and ranger notes both showed Maddox living on the edge of Ocala Forest at the exact time Owen vanished. The cabin Maddox rented was close to the trail the search team identified as where Owen's and the adult footprints ended. Maddox leaving the cabin just 1 day after the disappearance was documented in the rental log, creating a movement marker consistent with the hypothesis that he removed Owen from the area within the first 36 hours. Second point: unofficial water access near Blue Sink. Vehicle compression marks and ranger notes showed Maddox used a small boat on the southeastern stream. This aligned with the overlooked 1965 report of a faint engine sound leaving the forest around 4:57 in the afternoon. A time early enough for Owen to have been taken just minutes after losing parental sight. If Owen was removed by water, Maddox was the only person in the area with a boat, knowledge of the routes, and recorded presence at that exact access point. Third point: movement route from Ocala south toward coastal Florida, 1965 to 1966. When cross-referencing residency records, Maddox did not appear in any official paperwork for 12 months after leaving the cabin. However, the investigation team found 3 indirect indicators in tax data, work permit copies, and seasonal labor lists. a day labor paycheck in 1966 at a boat repair shop in the Palm Bay area, an entry on a labor list at a fishing raft construction site in Martin County, and scattered Florida Coast Guard notes about an unregistered boat described as matching Maddox's John boat. All three indicators lay along the land-water route connecting Ocala to eastern coastal Florida, forming a logical journey for someone traveling with a child small enough to avoid suspicion. Fourth point. The first appearance of the name Michael Ruiz in 1974. Ruiz is actually Owen's first official record appeared at a small high school near Gainesville. Notably, Gainesville lay directly on the route Maddox had passed through in 1966 and 1967 according to tax and employment records. Ruiz's initial emergence in this area strongly reinforced the hypothesis that Owen had been with Maddox for years without entering any civil system. The 1966 to 1974 gap is characteristic of an undocumented child raised outside formal education systems and only entered when someone decided to give the child a new identity, most likely the moment Maddox brought Owen to Gainesville and fully changed his identity. Fifth point. Florida Keys, 1976 to 1980. Civil records showed Ruiz lived in the Florida Keys area in the late 1970s, doing assistant work at a boat repair shop, exactly the same occupation Maddox had in the Keys in the late 1960s. Moreover, some co-workers from that time described Ruiz as very comfortable on the water, familiar with boats, unafraid of the sea, and quick with outboard engines, traits matching Maddox's skills. When compared, the investigation team realized Ruiz followed Maddox's exact occupational footprints, as if taught the trade directly from a young age. Ruiz, only appearing in records from 1974, yet possessing skills requiring years of prior experience, further supported the conclusion that the boy Owen grew up beside Maddox and learned directly from him. Sixth point. Movement between inland forest areas and boat docks, 1980 to 1990. Ruiz during this period had a movement pattern identical to Maddox. Short stays in forest-edge towns, work in boat repair shops, travel by small boat, and fairly isolated living. This was a nomadic lifestyle pattern not following traditional urban or rural models but suited to someone raised outside any fixed community. Seventh point. Genealogical structure and genetic footprints. When the analysis team overlaid Ruiz's timeline onto Maddox's, they found every area Ruiz lived in lay on Maddox's movement route. The regions where Ruiz appeared had tight ties to the Maddox genealogy via DNA. No point in Ruiz's life contradicted the hypothesis that the boy had been with Maddox immediately after being taken from the forest. All evidence from employment records, cabin location, water routes, new identity emergence, genetic genealogy, to occupational skills aligned in both space and time. Eighth point. Maddox's disappearance and Ruiz's stabilization. Maddox vanished from civil records after 1983, the year he was believed to have died in a small coastal town. Around the same time, Ruiz began stabilizing his residency. This matched the behavioral pattern of someone raised dependent on the only person they viewed as family and only able to establish an independent life after that person was gone. When all timelines were combined into a comprehensive chart, the investigation team obtained a complete picture. Maddox took Owen from Ocala by water in 1965, moved down the eastern coast, reached Gainesville, moved to the Keys, lived a nomadic life. Owen grew into Ruiz's identity, created in 1974. Ruiz lived with the same movement, occupation, geography, pattern as Maddox, until his death. This scenario described a journey spanning nearly 20 years and showed that Maddox's and Ruiz's movement timelines did not merely overlap, they fit together phase by phase, like two curves originating from the same starting point. Owen Harris did not vanish in the Ocala forest. That little boy lived and followed George Maddox's entire life journey before living his own. As the movement timelines of Maddox and Ruiz aligned almost perfectly, the investigation team reopened the Ocala forest map to search for all locations Maddox might have used during his back-and-forth movements between 1965 and 1970. The first cabin had provided enough traces to prove Owen had been there as a very small child. But based on the journey data, the investigation team believed Maddox did not use only one cabin. In that era, Ocala Forest had dozens of unregistered temporary cabins built by hunters, forest workers, or people living on the fringes of society, many of which had been forgotten for decades. A field sweep team was redeployed, following old trails documented in 1960s ranger maps. Many trails were overgrown with vegetation, but ancient positioning data combined with modern LiDAR maps helped the investigation team reconstruct the original terrain structure. When cross-referencing possible routes, the team quickly noticed a trail about 3.4 miles from the first cabin, passing through a low hill area and ending in an unusually dense tree section. At the end of this trail, they discovered rotted foundation and remaining wooden wall sections, signs of a second cabin, larger than the first one. There were no ranger records of this cabin from the 1970s onward, indicating it had been abandoned or hidden from records since its existence. Based on the wood decay level and remaining structure, the cabin could have been built in the 1950s or early 1960s, exactly the period Maddox lived in the Ocala forest. Inside the cabin, though most had deteriorated over time, the investigation team still found some items in intact condition. The inner wooden walls retained dust adhesion and chalk marks, but what drew the most attention was a small tin box wedged under rotted wood in the room corner. Inside the box there were no daily living items, only an old Ocala forest map, the type rangers used in the early 1960s, with many points marked by hand symbols. The marked points were not known cabins but deeper locations near small water branches where a boat could access undetected. Some positions overlapped with areas the search team had swept in 1965, but could not fully evaluate due to limited technology at the time. The presence of these symbols indicated the user of the second cabin, most likely Maddox, had established a system of movement through deep water terrain in the forest, using cabins as rest points to evade search teams tracing him. But the most important evidence came from a small detail in the rotted wall crack behind the cabin. When the technical team used soft brushes to sweep accumulated dust, they discovered a thin clump of hair stuck in the wood split. The strands were very fine, faded by time, but some sections still retained small root bulbs critical for DNA extraction. The hair sample was collected under ancient DNA preservation protocol, placed in a sterile tube, and immediately transferred to the lab. While awaiting results, the investigation team reconstructed the context of the second cabin. Its position lay directly between the route Maddox used to move between his rented cabin and the eastern water access. The distance from the second cabin to the first cabin was considerably shorter than the route from the Owen home to the first cabin, making the second cabin a logical stop for someone carrying a child if they wanted to avoid detection in the initial hours. Based on decay levels, the second cabin may have been abandoned by the late 1960s. This aligned with the period Maddox began leaving Ocala and moving toward Palm Bay, Gainesville. If Owen was with Maddox in the early years after disappearance, this cabin was very likely a place they sheltered before heading deeper south. When the DNA results from the hair sample returned, the forensic team received definitive confirmation. The DNA in the strands matched completely with Owen Harris's childhood DNA, cross-referenced from the 1965 fingernail sample. The hair strands, though tiny, showed that at least at one point Owen had been present in this cabin, and that carried entirely different meaning from the first cabin. The first cabin was too close to the disappearance scene and could have been a temporary holding spot for a few hours. But the second cabin was deeper in, clearly used as a longer-term hideout and part of an organized movement pattern. This indicated Owen was not just removed from the forest boundary, he was kept in the forest for a period before fully leaving the Ocala area. When cross-referencing the marked map in the tin box with modern geographic data, the forensic mappers realized the route structure overlapped with most of Maddox's reconstructed timeline movement. Many symbols showed Maddox had used water paths connecting the second cabin to even deeper hidden areas, allowing him to move quickly through the forest without leaving footprints or being detected by search teams. Finding Owen's hair in a second cabin, along with the hand-marked terrain map, reinforced the behavioral model. Maddox had clear planning, not impulsive action. He had a system of cabins, water paths, hideout points, and used them to move with Owen through multiple areas in the initial hours of the disappearance. This explained why the 1965 search team could not find clear traces after losing the footprints on the firmer ground. Another point making the second cabin evidence significant was its elevation. The cabin sat on higher ground, less affected by rain and runoff, causing items inside to degrade less than in the first cabin. Thanks to that, the tin box, map, and hair strands remained intact enough for analysis. When compiling the new evidence, the investigation team realized the second cabin was the missing link in the model. A chain connecting Maddox's rented cabin, the initial temporary cabin, and the water route out of the forest. This cabin also lay on the exact timeline route mentioned in the genealogical analysis, and Ruiz's timeline, the route Ruiz would years later repeat following Maddox's exact journey. The marked map proved Maddox had prepared long before the disappearance. Owen's hair proved the boy had been there, and the timing traces geographic distances matching the movement timeline proved the second cabin was a critical stop in the journey of Owen being taken from Ocala on July 14, 1965. The cabin faded by time, but the traces inside restored nearly the entire story no one had known for 60 years. When all the investigative threads were connected from the recovered 1965 evidence, the forgotten cabins, old water access points, modern DNA analysis, to genetic genealogy, the investigation team finally formed a comprehensive conclusion about the 60-year disappearance of Owen Harris. What generations of investigators could not achieve when technology was limited was accomplished through the combined data of forensic biology, genetic genealogy, and geographic behavioral analysis. The fingernail clipping obtained from the 1965 sealed envelope was the starting point of the breakthrough. DNA extracted from it separated two genomes, one from a small child, matching Owen Harris, and one from an unidentified adult male, later called unknown male. Methylation markers, alleles, and distribution levels fit a man with southeastern U.S. genetic patterns consistent with the Maddox family genealogy. When this DNA was uploaded to GED Match, numerous distant relatives from the Maddox, Alabama, North Florida, Florida Keys line appeared, gradually narrowing the suspect lineage. The genealogical information led to the suspect, George Maddox, who lived in the Ocala forest at the exact time Owen vanished, left the area just 1 day later, had his own cabin, owned a boat, and moved along the exact geographic route suggested by the DNA analysis. Maddox traveled through Gainesville, Palm Bay, Florida Keys, places where Ruiz, Owen, later appeared. His records matched the footprints, occupation, and complex multi-year movement pattern. The reconstructed timeline structure showed Maddox was present at the forest boundary when Owen vanished. The cabin Maddox rented lay near the footprint endpoint route. The first cabin contained indirect evidence of a small child's presence. The second cabin, discovered using old ranger maps and terrain data, contained a tin box with Maddox's hand-marked terrain map showing water access points along with Owen's hair, fully matching DNA from the extracted fingernail sample. The second cabin was a deeper hideout, and showed Maddox took Owen into the forest before removing him from Ocala by water. The water route from the second cabin perfectly matched the hand-marked map found in the tin box. The marked positions aligned with ranger notes about unregistered small boats Maddox used. The vehicle compression marks found near Blue Sink matched the description of Maddox's John boat in old records. The deputies' overlooked report about a faint engine sound leaving the forest at 4:57 in the afternoon matched the time the K9 lost Owen's trail and the adult footprints ended. When Maddox's timeline was reassembled from 1965 to 1983, every appearance point lay directly on the movement axis. Ruiz later replicated through civil records, cabin, Gainesville, Palm Bay, Keys. The points where Ruiz appeared all lay on routes Maddox used, showing Owen lived with him in the early years after disappearance. This was reinforced by the allele matching level between UN noun male and Ruiz, a level close to direct relation but not father-son, suggesting Ruiz lived beside this person long enough to absorb environmental, occupational, and lifestyle traces. Direct DNA analysis from Ruiz's tissue sample, 2024, and Owen's DNA, 1965, provided the strongest conclusion. The two samples belonged to the same person, confirming Ruiz is Owen Harris. From there, the entire case timeline was reconstructed through genetic memory, physical evidence, and geographic behavior. When placing all the evidence, DNA, footprints, cabins, marked map, movement history, employment records, renewed identity into the comprehensive model. The investigation team reached the final result. George Maddox was the person who abducted Owen Harris on July 14, 1965. He kept Owen in the Ocala forest at 2 different cabins, then removed the boy from the forest by water, traveling along the route the one described by the second cabin map. Maddox continued carrying Owen with him for many years, taking him through coastal and inland Florida areas before giving him a new identity. Michael Ruiz, around 1974. Maddox was never investigated while the case was hot, due to lost evidence, limited forensic technology, and insufficient connections between the forest water routes. He continued his nomadic life until dying in 1983, recorded in a death certificate at a small Florida coastal town from natural causes. The disappearance thought unsolvable for 6 decades was finally cracked through the combination of DNA technology, genealogical analysis, and scene geographic reconstruction. With irrefutable evidence, cabin items, Owen's hair, Maddox's map, matching timelines, genealogical match, and especially DNA confirming Ruiz is Owen, the Marion County Investigation Agency issued the official conclusion. Owen Harris was abducted in 1965 by George Maddox, who died in 1983. Owen Harris is still alive and has lived under the name Michael Ruiz for 60 years. After completing all DNA analyses, reconstructing the movement journey, confirming physical evidence from the 2 Ocala forest cabins, and establishing a clear genealogical link between the Maddox lineage and Owen Harris's identity, the Marion County Sheriff officially entered the final phase of legal procedure, closing the longest-running cold case in county history, with the conclusion, solved. Closing a cold case requires a multi-step process. First, all evidence and documents were compiled into a hundreds of pages long case summary reconstruction, prepared by the modern investigation team and the forensic department, in which every piece of evidence and every DNA result was attached to the corresponding timeline. This document was designed to replace the fragmented, illogical reports from the 1960s with a single version consistent in both forensic and legal terms. The summary began with the original footprint sequence, the sock, the first cabin, and the second cabin, followed by DNA analysis results from the fingernail and hair, followed by Maddox's marked map, and finally, the overlapping movement records between Maddox and Owen, under the Ruiz identity from 1965 until the end of Maddox's life. Everything was presented as a combined event flow, with each item backed by forensic evidence verified by independent state agencies. Next, the sheriff submitted the conclusion to the state attorney's office, including the classification proposal, primary offender identified, deceased. Identifying Maddox as the sole perpetrator was based on 3 pillars. 1. Cabin evidence hair, matching DNA, Maddox's map used to move with the child. 2. Forensic DNA, unknown male, from Maddox lineage, Ruiz is Owen Harris. 3. Geographic timeline, Maddox left Ocala the day after the disappearance, moved along the exact route where Ruiz appeared. The state attorney reviewed the entire file to ensure the conclusion was based on objective evidence, not speculation or coincidence. Upon completion of the review, the prosecutor's office signed the section "No Viable Alternate Suspect," confirming Maddox was the only individual fitting all the data. Following Florida procedure, the file was then sent to the State Cold Case Review Board to ensure consistency between forensic DNA, genealogical DNA, and scene reconstruction. The board paid special attention to the conclusion that Ruiz is Owen, as this was the most critical evidence redefining the entire case. When 3 independent labs confirmed absolute DNA match, the board approved the file without dispute. After all 3 levels of verification were complete, the Marion County Sheriff issued the case closure report. Solved, 2025, marking the first time since 1965 that Owen's disappearance was classified as solved. In the final report, the sheriff clearly stated, George Maddox, a transient resident, hunter, and forest laborer, was the person who removed Owen from Ocala National Forest on July 14, 1965. Maddox kept Owen in 2 forest cabins, Using a small boat to evade searches, Owen was taken out of Ocala by water route, traveling with Maddox across Florida for many years. In 1974, Owen was given a new identity under the name Michael Ruiz. Maddox died in 1983, therefore prosecution is impossible. Ruiz Owen is still alive today. Marking solved was not just administrative procedure. It ended 60 years of a family without answers, 60 years of a child considered permanently missing, 60 years of investigators left with only blanks on maps and footprints leading nowhere. The file was then reclassified into 3 parts. 1. Evidence Archive, where the 1965 physical evidence is preserved, including the sweater, cloth piece, fingernail, hair, cabin map. 2. Forensic reports, all DNA records, genealogical tree, recovered timeline. 3. Legal closure record documents confirming the offender and the status unprosecutable due to death. Each part was digitized and stored in the state system under new regulations for cold cases with forensic historical value. Finally, the sheriff added a short line to the front page of the file. Case closed after 60 years by combined application of forensic DNA, genealogical profiling, and historic scene reconstruction. That was the official legal ending for what seemed the most hopeless case in the Ocala forest. A dry line, written in black ink, but behind it lay 60 years of loss, mistakes, mystery, and finally an undeniable answer. Owen Harris did not vanish, he survived. And the 60-year disappearance is now closed. The story of Owen Harris, the 3-year-old boy who vanished in 1965 and reappeared in the records as Michael Ruiz, is not only a case solved after 6 decades, but also a profound reminder to American society today about responsibility, vigilance, and the value of scientific progress. Details once thought insignificant in the case, like the fingernail clipping sealed in 1965, or the hair found in the second cabin, became the keys to cracking it thanks to next-generation DNA technology. This shows that science does not just create change in laboratories, it can deliver justice to families who thought all hope was lost. It reminds us that every piece of evidence, no matter how small, deserves respect and preservation. Additionally, the case highlights the importance of records data transparency in modern American society. The gap in Michael Ruiz's records before 1974 shows the consequences of lacking oversight and community safety. Today, when children frequently move between states and many families live in mobile communities, tracking educational, medical, and identity records has become essential to protect children from exploitation or being taken unnoticed. The Owen case also reminds us that the community plays a vital role. If the green pickup truck or the strange engine sound had been fully documented in 1965, the investigation might have been different. In modern American society, where anyone can report via phone, security cameras, or social media, awareness and timely action can save a life. Finally, the story emphasizes that justice may come late, but it is never too late to seek the truth. That reflects America's core values: perseverance, faith in science, and never giving up when it comes to children's right to safety. Thank you for joining us on this journey to unravel a 60-year disappearance. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe to continue supporting stories illuminated by truth and science. See you in the next video, where we continue exploring mysteries thought long forgotten but still waiting to have their voices heard again.